Hello and welcome, Dr. Hussein. I would like to start with, asking you to kindly introduce yourself. What do you do? What is your line of training? And where do you work and on what issues?
Thank you, Abdullah. My name is Hussein Wario, and just to start with, training-wise, I'm trained initially in bachelor's degree in biological sciences. Later, I pursued master's degree in natural resource management at the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. And after that, I did PhD in socio-ecological systems, particularly looking at issues of pastoral social systems in the changing context. And this I did at the Kassel University, which is in Germany. Currently, I head a local outfit called Center for Research and Development in Drylands, which is a local nonprofit entity that basically looks at broad issues of how can we tackle the issues of research and development, within the dryland context. Of course, previously I have worked with various international organizations, so I have been present in this research and development arena for the last, say, 14 years or so, working in northern Kenya, southern Ethiopia, with organizations such as Care International, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, partly also with IUCN. So currently, of course, with Center for Research, we want to entrench, participatory research approaches and also participatory development processes, to address some of the critical issues, and doing this as, people from the area working with our local knowledge base. So that is currently what we really engage in.
It's really exciting to say, Dr. Hussein. Then let's dive into it. Wildlife conservation has a very long history, from the days of the fortress model and now increasingly community wildlife conservation. Would you kindly, give us, a short history of wildlife conservation from the fortress model, which was largely a colonial model, to where we are now, quote unquote, community conservation?
Yeah, thank you. I think when talking about wildlife conservation, one thing that, even as students of natural resource management, that formed example of the basis of conservation is the establishment of the Yellowstone National Park, I think in the 1870s in the US. And this model was, seen as noble and borrowed across the world. And at the time, conservation was premised, on the idea that the humans, interference, is what is affecting the nature. And the main aim was conservation at the time was, to preserve nature in its pristine state, such that human activities, are completely guarded against, and particularly issues of ecosystem use, that provided livelihoods are seen as illegal, to undertake in protected areas. And for them, of course, to enforce this, then it meant that they had to bring in armed guards or fence the area off. And these are also followed by punitive fines, for people who breach these rules. And of course, this is what was borrowed, and it provided routes for conservation and protected areas in our areas now, Africa, per se, Kenya, especially. And then being presented now in that format also, the gatekeepers are now, the colonialists, the whites, who had the authority to establish this, and they established this also as a preserve for the whites. And the people who are kept away now are the real owners and the local people who were initially actually the protectors of the same environment before the white colonialists came. And of course, later with research, with various, studies coming out, it was disapproved and found to be counterproductive. It actually breaches on rights, of local communities to be able to manage, to benefit from these resources. So, and this, of course, is now what slowly led to the birth of the community conservation approach. And as we all know, it initially took root in those southern parts of Africa, especially Zimbabwe, I think we'll talk about some examples in our conversation, maybe if time allows. So now or later, of course, this evolution went alongside with, you know, the bottom-up development approaches that were being promoted, communities' knowledge being appreciated, you know, and of course, appreciating that there were the managers and stewards of these landscapes and the natural resources that are in them for generations. So in brief, that is it. And of course, currently now we have community conservation, and it's in various forms. And we can also talk about this as we proceed with our discussion.
Thank you, Sen. That is very comprehensive. And one of the communities that really are at the sharp end of, you know, the battle between wildlife conservation and the government and civil society organizations or non-profits who are working on wildlife conservation is the pastoralist community. The current, you know, wildlife conservation game parks, national parks, most of them in Kenya at least, were all derived from pastoral lands. But now this is the second phase where, at least in the north, we are seeing, you know, a huge influx of non-profits trying to establish community wildlife conservation in the north. I wanted you to speak about this dichotomy where wildlife is seen as good and pastoralism is seen as bad. You see efforts still, despite the evidence, that sees what, you know, pastoralists should lead a settled life. And you see that effort going on. You know, the huge influx of, you know, organizations like NRT, Northern Rangeland Trust, you know, expanding their work into places like Isiolo, Samburu, and Marsabit. Would you comment, how would you comment about this, where pastoralism that has provided livelihood and way of life for many communities for many years is now seen as bad, and wildlife conservation is seen as good? How and, you know, this clash, would you kindly speak about it from policy and history and the current reality that we are facing?
Well, thanks. Yeah, I think that is a very, you know, strong thesis that is out there in terms of, you know, presenting wildlife conservation as, you know, a competitor or, you know, or even sometimes a substitute to pastoralism. And of course, we know that in Kenya, wildlife-based tourism is one of the largest foreign exchange earners. And of course, in this, one thing that is not acknowledged is the fact that this wildlife, even as you've said, the protected areas were heaved off from pastoralist lands, and even so, more than, I mean, 60% of the wildlife again still roam the communal rangelands. And when you look at, you know, people talking about the income from tourism, they never mention or even acknowledge, you know, this as a resource being generated from the communal rangelands. And an interesting conversation, you know, with Kenyans had was around this, the Building Bridges initiative and how it wanted to change, you know, resource sharing. And they said, I mean, one of the things that you must be aware that created a lot of conversation is resources are allocated to people and not to land. And basically, by essence, people are saying, we, the pastoralists, are on empty land that is not being used and cannot be used as basis of resource sharing. And incidentally, of course, the same foreign currency earners from wildlife tourism is not just based on, you know, the beach hotels or the hotels that you see the tourists spend on. The tourists basically come, you know, to watch this wildlife, and it is actually this land that generates this income. And of course, what we have seen now is that then from, you know, the marginalization perspective, these regions have had, you know, just short end of stick in terms of resources being allocated. And because of these non-profits are the one that, you know, run the businesses here to, you know, support people, gain some income and enhance their livelihoods. And wildlife has been brought to the center now as one of these, you know, possibilities of communities getting income. And the proponents here now, sometimes, I think whether, you know, by either being ignorant or by not knowing really what they're talking about, they present wildlife income as a substitute to what we get from livestock. And in actually presenting this, they plan for wildlife and within it, then talk about grazing management. And as you've said, these are the approaches especially used by an entity like the Northern Rangeland Trust. And furthermore, in parts of the rangelands already, there's exclusive wildlife zones that are created, and nobody looks at what impact does this have on the larger pastoral production system. Insecurity, is brought about by government not really bringing focus here. And now wildlife conservation again is being brought in as a problem solver that can solve the insecurity issues because it uses armed guards that do extra work beyond wildlife protection. So in this connotation, the profit and the non-profit entities are pushing the agenda that actually wildlife presence, it's like something new, and pastoralists are being taught how to care for this wildlife, and they're not acknowledging the knowledge, the basis upon which this wildlife has been preserved all along. And this is what brings about the clashes. I think it's in terms of misconceptions, I will say, by the promoters of wildlife conservation currently.
And thank you again, Sen, for your insight. Let's speak about this community wildlife conservation as a model. It's a model that is, fronted by the proponents who say it's a win-win for, wildlife conservation as well as pastoralism. You touched on it at the tail end where you said, what is hardly acknowledged is the indigenous knowledge of the community around wildlife conservation, their rangeland, weather pattern, climate, and plant science, although it's not acknowledged as such. But it's also, people do not realize that it's very difficult to replace the income and benefits that you get from pastoralism or cattle and other forms of, animals that people keep versus the money that comes from tourism. Do you want to speak about that? Because a lot of the time what you hear is so just peace and security because of the use of the rangers. It's also they say, oh no, this is economically beneficial to the pastoralist. Would you kindly, speak about that?
Yeah, on this subject especially, one thing that happens or has been happening nationally is that pastoralism has never been acknowledged, as an important contributor to the gross domestic product of this country. A lot of times people, with growth of economies, people define I want to have fine meat and all this good meat, that Nyamachoma bases provide in Nairobi. And people don't reflect on where this comes from and, what value and who is creating this value in this. So based on this lack of, acknowledgement of contribution of pastoralism, the contribution by wildlife is, I will say, over-glorified in this region. Particularly, if you look at even the wildlife distribution here, it's so sparse, and if you only entrench actually wildlife conservation on the monetary value, we will never get an equivalent for it. And often, even in terms of land use, it's never kind of valued vis-a-vis what other supplementary values that are there. So I will say that the proponents of wildlife conservation currently do not really look in depth into what pastoralism provides. And I will say this is guided by, some of the disapproved policy papers or research, for example, like the tragedy of the commons that has, governed policies or influenced policies for a long time. So they come with this notion that, pastoralists overstock the range, they degrade the rangelands, they need to, as you've said, settle, to be managed, to be modernized. And this is the approach that also the wildlife conservancies bring to the core of this conservation approach. And of course, currently, something that has been acknowledged is the prudent use of the land by pastoralists through mobility. And I will say for wildlife conservation also, besides, in addition to acknowledging the community's own knowledge in this, using their own practice, of even keeping the livestock mobile and covering the range as an asset, to wildlife conservation, such that whatever is presented as an economic advantage of wildlife basically builds on the main livelihood that is there, but not in terms of trying to replace it. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I mean, like every time I explain to, people that, pastoralism actually contribute a significant chunk to the GDP, people do not want to deal with that because, 89% of the beef produced in this country comes from the, pastoral areas. People don't want to deal with that. Pastoralism contributes at least 13% to the GDP, and it employs almost directly and indirectly, over 10 million people. But people do not want that because there is a general consensus that has got its roots in colonialism, that pastoralism is not good. It doesn't contribute to the GDP. It degrades the rangeland, when in reality, these guys, the survival, the taking care of the rangeland is at the core of the survival, because once the rangeland is gone, they've got nowhere to take their take their livestock. The Zimbabwean Campfire Model is held as a gold standard within, the wildlife conservation, particularly in Kenya, from where it is borrowed. But in your opinion, that model is faulty. Do you mind speaking about it in a little bit of details for people who are not aware of the Campfire Model?
Thank you, Abdullah. I think the Campfire Model is, one of the best models that used to be presented to us as students of conservation. And up to date, I think there are discussions around it. It's still in existence and still running. The history of it dates back to around 1975, when the Zimbabwe government did an act around parks and its wildlife. And the element within this act that is quite important is it converted the ownership of wildlife, to be communal. And by this, it opened doors for communities to be able to benefit from wildlife, as well as actually now wildlife that are on communally held areas, which is also a huge expanse because Zimbabwe also has a lot of savanna, to be actually co-managed, with communities. And of course, as a result, it attracted a lot of donor attention, particularly the likes of the USAID that came in, to support communities, because previously there has been a lot of criticism around wildlife conservation, especially the benefits to the local people. How can the aspects of wildlife human conflict around protected areas will still be managed, and now this one gave opportunity for donors to come in and support communities who lived around these communally owned wildlife areas, to encourage tourism in this sector. But if you look at it, much of the income from this was based on, the practice of trophy hunting that is, I think, still in practice in Zimbabwe. And so this brought in cash, and this cash now is what motivated communities to start. And this is now where the Campfire project was born. And of course, and still today, using of renewable wildlife resources in a profitable manner is a conversation that that goes on. And definitely, with the donor support, it became quite successful, and a lot of studies were done that showed that communities benefited. But as it were with development projects, donors are not there, all the time throughout the life of the people. So, but before the donors withdraw, some of the things that were claimed was, it reduced human-wildlife conflict, beside, of course, getting dividends to the community, and it also reduced poaching. That's what it was thought. But then when, of course, the donors withdrew, or even reduced the amounts, definitely the dividends people got from the conservation reduced. And as a result, I mean, there are questions around its sustainability, and because from hunting, from the number of visitors, still the income is not substantial to support communities to the level that they wanted. And as also there are, I mean, claims that there has been increase, you know, in human life, wildlife conflict around protected areas again, and these conservancies, illegal hunting has been there. And if you look at conservation in Kenya also now, it's based on that kind of model. And I think before 1992, hunting, you know, trophy hunting was allowed. And a number of early conservancies around like Kipia, for example, that has been established by private ranchers is based on these licenses for trophy hunting, as well as actually sale of game meat. But now from 1992, when this ban came in, it was a game changer and actually affected this stream of revenue from the licensing of trophy hunting, especially. So with that in mind, the conservancies that has been set up keep on struggling actually to, you know, raise actually even basic management expenses. And up to date, actually, conservancies in our region, the northern parts, I think none can raise even the basics to keep them running, based on the models, of course, that has been established by the likes of the Northern Rangeland Trust. So I think that is the early history of that Zimbabwean Campfire Model, which, of course, has not been perfect as thought.
In terms of, you know, the distinction between, there is always this debate around wildlife conservancy and wildlife conservation and pastoralism. The model of, you know, community wildlife conservation is a win-win for both. The pastoralist communities win, and, you know, the conservation of wildlife also wins. That is how, you know, in northern counties, the NRT and people who support them present this. Is there some truth to that? From as a skeptical observer, for me, when you have, you know, pastoralism just doesn't give you food that you eat. There are other intrinsic benefit that you get from pastoralism. So can you give us some insights on if this holds true, if examined empirically?
Thanks. I think when it comes to, you know, conservation on communal lands, I mean, communities have done this for free, let's say, and the benefit or even the value that communities attach to wildlife is different from the monetary one that's being attached now with the current conservation move. If you look at, you know, how currently people are enticed, you know, to establish wildlife conservancies, there are tokens that are brought along. You know, you will say that they come to education facilities, water, you know, provide bursaries, and this is now the tokens upon which people are convinced. And above all, actually, one thing that when you ask communities why they need to establish a conservancy is they need to have armed people patrolling, you know, their rangelands. It's the insecurity that is, you know, persistent that motivates people more, actually. Because I've talked to, I mean, conservancies in like Kipia, for example, in Samburu, in Isiolo, and they say, and even the ones who want to establish now, we have had meetings with people who, you know, sort of pro and, you know, against. And the pro people, the first thing they say is, our neighbors have fleets of vehicles and, you know, hundreds of armed rangers who come in, you know, when there's conflict over resources. Why don't we have the same? And I had even similar conversation with one of, I think, a director at the National Northern Rangeland Trust. And these are the same arguments that people bring. So when you look at the benefits, of course, any additional income, you know, that people get from the services that you are using their land is a welcome. And as you know, and as you've said, you know, with pastoralism, times are also challenging. And you will see that with climate change, with, you know, frequencies in drought, there's ultimately need. And also as population increases, of course, you cannot accommodate everyone, to join the pastoralism economy and be able to sustain their livelihoods. Therefore, alternative options for livelihoods is always a welcome. But the way it's being done, for me, it doesn't bring out the real value of why we need to conserve, to the communities. We need to look at why has there been wildlife population all these years without or very minimal conservation efforts going on, and how can we, turn it around for communities to keep on doing the same thing that they're doing rather, and reduce on maybe if there are bad things that they're doing that affect the wildlife conservation, for them to get additional income from their land. And in that way, it can be touted as a win-win situation. But again, I don't know if you want me to proceed in this direction. One other thing that I think we mentioned the last time is there's always, there's always this need for land. And when you look at conservation, always they will like, and of course, originating from historical aspect on how to establish, they always want within even these conservancies, pristine areas, wildlife exclusive areas that it will be slowly, restricted to livestock grazing. And this one now, and especially these portions of land, if you look at it again critically, there could be, the key resources that aids the pastoralists to survive through, the worst of periods, to reach the rainfall season. And once this is removed, then again, nobody really within the conservation, I think, arguments look at what is the impact of doing that. Is it win-win actually, or we are pushing communities into, more unsustainable livelihood options? So I think for me, to make it win-win situation, we look at the basics of what communities have been doing, build on this, and definitely, I think the community involvement that is there within the conservancies, again, it's questionable. Who benefits actually, it's questionable. And this, I don't know if you want me to continue in the interest of time, but I will be short. What happens is, it's touted that communities own, conservancies. But if you look deep inside, the ownership is not as portrayed or as presented. For instance, even legally, when you look at establishment of community conservancies, it's put on, some, I would say also almost shaky legal grounds, and it borrows from one law to another for it to be established. It cannot also survive only on the Wildlife Management Act itself. It requires actually community-based organizations and the law that establishes these community-based organizations for it to, register. And when you look at community-based organizations, these are almost like semi-private entities, individuals of interest coming together, registering a community-based organization. And then this is now what is purported as a community. And these are the people who control the benefits, from these, make decisions on behalf of the community. And by extent, actually, because of the nature of how the likes of NRT has also put, entire communal areas, under conservancies, give these people a lot of powers, to control even grazing of communities, which I think also impacts on, the benefits people get from pastoralism and other resources that are on this land. So for it to be said win-win, I think a lot needs to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah. Which takes us to the final one, and that is, you've touched on it a little bit, is how can we have a harder wildlife conservation model? Do you want to speak about that a little bit in the interest of time and before we wrap up?
Yeah, I think, this is one thing that I fronted. And this is based on, of course, on, looking at what are the objectives of, conservation from the community perspectives and from the conservation movements. What are the objectives and how can we reconcile, to have a common objective around this? And if you look at it currently, and we have said this before, the model that is being presented is the one that brings in armed guards, bringing these 4x4 drives, and this in essence already shifts the power, between the people themselves. Even if they hired, guards are from the same localities, once they are in that uniform and they have a gun, they completely change now to a different level. And actually it brings back the relics of, protecting the people from the same resources that they have always conserved. And one thing that I also see is that if there is hunting, for example, or poaching by the communities, I think there's little that these rangers can do unless the communities, are really convinced and that they are in tune with the objectives of, what the conservancy needs to do. And in this essence, what I argue is that we have herders who are always there in the rangelands, whether it's supported or not, they're always there in the rangeland, and they cover all the extent of the rangelands that are there. And they interact with these wild animals, on almost daily basis. My argument is if, we use these people who are always out there, motivate them maybe just a little bit, to be just keen and be observant and be able to have a communication system or channel, to relay information about wildlife locations, and if there are issues, they can do this as well as, similar way they do herding. And we need to borrow on certain values. For example, among our communities here, particularly the Borans, they have age-old practice around water. For example, when they are done with watering their livestock from these deep wells that, even wildlife cannot access, they always leave the troughs full, at the end of the watering rota. And this is, they will say, is the water for hyenas and the lions. And unless they do that, either these wild animals will fall into these deep wells or even die of thirst, or even come into the homesteads, sick, and wildlife-human conflict can increase. So these are some of the values that I think conservation needs to borrow, enhance, and I think in a more sustainable, especially looking at the economic sense of it, be able to conserve wildlife for the benefit, of the people and for the benefit of the conservation in its own intrinsic value. So herders themselves, without using guns, without using weapons, without using the power, they can, in my opinion, be enhanced to manage, capacity to manage conservation. So that is the gist of the argument for me. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much, Hussein. This has been an incredible discussion. I know, there is a lot to be covered, and, this is not by any means the last discussions that me and you will be having on this. Thank you so much for your time and your insight. Thank you once again, and, keep doing the good work that you guys are doing, and have a nice day, Hussein. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.